For nearly 2 decades, there's been one fact about the internet so stable, so unquestioned, that most people never even thought to consider it might change. Chrome wins. Whatever the competition, whatever the alternative, whatever clever new browser some startup or rival tech company tried to launch, Chrome simply stayed on top, quietly running on the majority of the world's computers and phones, so dominant that for most people, the word browser and the word Chrome had basically become interchangeable. That stability is now being tested in a way it has not been tested in years, and the threat is not coming from where you would expect. It is not another traditional browser trying to out-Chrome Chrome with a slightly better interface or slightly faster load times. It is coming from an entirely new category of software that did not exist in any meaningful form even 3 years ago, and it is forcing Google into a position it has not had to seriously occupy in a very long time, playing defense. To understand why this moment is genuinely different from the countless other times people have declared a browser war over the years, you need to understand exactly how dominant Chrome's position has actually been, and why that dominance mattered so much beyond just bragging rights. Chrome has, for years, commanded a majority share of the global browser market, by a wide margin the most used browser on Earth, across desktop and mobile combined. That kind of market position translates directly into real power for Google. Control over the default search experience hundreds of millions of people use every single day, a direct pipeline into the advertising data that fuels Google's core business, and enormous influence over web standards themselves, since a browser with that much market share effectively shapes how the entire internet gets built, given that developers naturally prioritize compatibility with whatever browser the majority of their users actually have installed. This dominance did not happen by accident, and it is worth being fair about how Chrome actually earned that position in the first place, rather than assuming it was simply handed to Google through unfair advantage alone. When Chrome first launched back in 2008, it was genuinely faster, genuinely more stable, and genuinely more minimalist than the browsers competing against it at the time, arriving at a moment when Internet Explorer had grown bloated and Firefox, while beloved by more technical users, had not achieved the same kind of mainstream polish. Chrome earned its dominance the old-fashioned way initially by simply being a better product, and it maintained that dominance for years afterward through continuous investment in speed, security, and the kind of seamless integration with Google's other services that made it the natural, convenient default for the average user who was not particularly interested in comparing browsers closely. So what has actually changed now in 2026 that has people seriously talking about a genuine threat to that dominance for the first time in years? The answer comes down to artificial intelligence, specifically the emergence of an entirely new category of browser built from the ground up around AI capability, rather than having AI features bolted onto a traditional browsing experience as an afterthought. This distinction matters enormously, and it is the core of why this moment feels different from previous browser competition cycles. Perplexity, the AI search and answer company that built its reputation on providing direct, sourced answers to questions rather than simply returning a list of links the way traditional search has always worked, launched its own browser called Comet, built specifically around the idea that browsing itself should be an active, assistant-driven experience rather than a passive one. Rather than simply displaying web pages for you to read and navigate manually, Comet is designed to actively help you accomplish tasks directly within the browsing experience itself, summarizing content, answering questions about what you are currently looking at, and, in more advanced use cases, actually taking actions on your behalf across websites, filling out forms, comparing prices, or pulling together information from multiple sources without you needing to manually visit and read through each one individually. OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, has moved into the same space with its own browser called Atlas, representing perhaps the most direct, symbolically significant challenge to Chrome specifically because of exactly who is behind it. OpenAI has spent the past several years building one of the most recognized, most widely used AI products in the world, and bringing that same underlying AI capability directly into a full browser, rather than existing as a separate tool users have to switch over to, represents a fundamentally different kind of competitive threat than anything Chrome has faced in years. The core pitch is similar to Comet's, an assistant woven directly into the fabric of how you browse the web. Rather than treating AI as a separate destination, you visit only when you specifically remember to. Microsoft, meanwhile, has taken yet another approach, leaning heavily into integrating its own Copilot AI assistant directly into Edge, the browser built into every Windows installation by default. This is a genuinely important piece of the picture, Because unlike Perplexity or OpenAI, both of which are essentially starting from zero in terms of existing browser market share, Microsoft already controls the default browser experience on every single Windows machine sold, meaning its AI-powered version of Edge does not need to convince anyone to actively download and switch. It simply needs to convince the enormous existing base of Windows users who have never bothered to change their default browser away from whatever came pre-installed to actually start using the AI features, already sitting there waiting for them. There's also a smaller but genuinely interesting player worth understanding in this picture. The browser company, which built a genuinely well-regarded browser called Arc that developed a passionate, if relatively niche, following among more design-conscious, tech-forward users. Before the company made the notable decision to shift its primary focus toward a newer, more explicitly AI-native browser called Dia, essentially betting that the future of browsing belongs to this AI assistant model rather than to the more traditional tab and bookmark browsing paradigm Arc itself had tried to meaningfully reinvent just a couple years earlier. The fact that a company already building a genuinely well-loved alternative browser felt the need to pivot specifically toward this AI native model tells you something meaningful about where the real competitive energy in this space is currently concentrated. So what exactly makes this AI native approach to browsing genuinely different from Chrome, beyond simply having a chatbot feature bolted onto the side of a traditional browsing experience, since Google itself has certainly not been sitting still, and has been steadily adding its own Gemini AI features directly into Chrome as well? The distinction, according to the companies building these AI native browsers, comes down to design philosophy at a fundamental level, rather than simply feature checklist comparison. Chrome, even with AI features added, remains at its core a tool for displaying web pages that a human then reads and navigates manually, with AI functioning as a helpful sidebar or occasional assistant layered on top of that fundamentally unchanged core experience. Comet, Atlas, and Dia are each, in their own specific way, attempting something more structurally different, building the browser around the assumption that a meaningful portion of everyday browsing tasks can and should be handled by an AI agent acting on your behalf, with the traditional experience of manually clicking through web pages becoming a secondary mode you drop into specifically when you want direct hands-on control, rather than remaining the primary default way the browser expects you to interact with the web. This is where it is genuinely worth pausing to be fair and balanced, because this entire AI native browsing category, exciting and genuinely novel as it is, remains considerably earlier in its development and adoption than the more breathless coverage of this trend sometimes suggests. None of these AI native browsers currently hold anything close to a meaningful share of the overall browser market compared to Chrome's continued massive dominance. Early adoption has been concentrated heavily among more technically engaged AI-curious users, specifically seeking out this kind of experience, rather than reflecting any broad mainstream shift away from Chrome among typical everyday internet users, who have never given much thought to which specific browser they happen to be using. The gap between genuine early enthusiast excitement and actual mainstream market share remains, honestly, still quite large, and it would be dishonest to frame this as Chrome already losing its dominant position in any measurable current sense. That said, the reason this still genuinely qualifies as a real, meaningful threat worth taking seriously, rather than dismissible hype, comes down to a few specific factors that distinguish this moment from previous browser competition cycles that ultimately fizzled out without meaningfully denting Chrome's position. First, the companies building these AI native browsers are not small. Underfunded startups easily outlasted through Google's sheer scale and resources the way so many previous browser challengers historically were. OpenAI and Perplexity in particular have both raised enormous amounts of capital and built genuinely large, engaged user bases through their existing AI products, giving them real resources and, critically, an existing warm audience, already primed to trust and adopt their new browser offerings, rather than needing to build interest completely from scratch the way an unknown startup browser would. Second, and arguably more significant, this specific moment in AI development represents a genuine platform shift, rather than simply an incremental feature improvement, the kind of shift that has historically been exactly when dominant incumbents become most vulnerable to disruption throughout the broader history of the technology industry. Chrome achieved its own dominance in part by recognizing and building specifically for the shift toward web applications and cloud-based computing at exactly the right moment, arguably at Internet Explorer's own expense during that earlier transition. There's a real, legitimate argument that AI native browsing represents a similarly significant shift in how people fundamentally interact with the internet, and that companies built from the ground up specifically around that new paradigm may hold a genuine structural advantage over an incumbent whose entire architecture and design philosophy was built for a previous era, even if that incumbent is actively working to retrofit AI capabilities onto its existing foundation. Third, and this is a genuinely important piece of the broader picture, that extends well beyond just the AI browser competition itself. Google has simultaneously been dealing with serious antitrust and regulatory pressure, specifically targeting its search and browser dominance, adding an entirely separate layer of complexity and genuine vulnerability to Chrome's position that has nothing directly to do with AI at all. Google has faced extended antitrust litigation in the United States, specifically examining whether its search dominance, closely intertwined with Chrome's own market position, given how tightly integrated the two products are, constitutes an illegal monopoly, with remedies under serious consideration at various points in that litigation, including proposals as significant as potentially requiring Google to divest Chrome entirely into a separate independent company. Whatever the ultimate legal outcome of that specific litigation turns out to be, and the exact resolution has continued evolving as the case has proceeded through the courts, the mere existence of this serious regulatory pressure represents a genuine, documented threat to Chrome's current position that exists entirely independent of the AI browser competition, layering directly on top of it and adding considerable additional uncertainty to Google's overall competitive position in this space heading forward. So how has Google actually responded to this combined pressure, both the emerging AI native browser competition and the separate ongoing antitrust scrutiny? On the AI front specifically, Google has been steadily integrating its own Gemini AI model directly into Chrome, adding AI-powered features including page summarization, an AI-assisted address bar capable of answering questions and performing tasks directly, and broader agentic capabilities, allowing Gemini to take actions on your behalf across the web in ways that increasingly echo exactly what Comet, Atlas, and Dia are each independently attempting to offer as their own core, differentiating value proposition. This response makes complete strategic sense given Google's position, since Chrome's single greatest asset remains its enormous existing installed user base, an asset none of the newer AI native browsers currently come close to matching, meaning Google's most rational competitive strategy is very likely to bring genuinely comparable AI capability directly to the users it already has, rather than ceding that specific battlefield entirely to newer, smaller competitors, and hoping its existing market share advantage alone proves sufficient to weather the shift. Whether Google's specific approach to integrating AI into Chrome proves genuinely as compelling and differentiated as the ground-up AI native design philosophy driving Comet, Atlas, and Dia remains a genuinely open, actively contested question, and reasonable observers following the space closely currently hold real, differing opinions on it. Some argue that Google's approach, layering sophisticated AI capability on top of Chrome's already dominant, deeply familiar existing foundation, represents the more practical, ultimately more successful path forward, specifically because it does not require the friction of getting users to abandon a browser they are already comfortable with and switch to something entirely unfamiliar. Others argue that meaningfully reimagining the fundamental browsing experience around AI genuinely does require building that experience from the ground up around that specific paradigm from day one, rather than retrofitting new AI capability onto an architecture that was never originally designed with that underlying assumption in mind, and that Google's own deeply established product habits and legacy design assumptions may ultimately limit how far it can genuinely push in that more fundamentally reimagined direction, even with considerable resources and genuine effort behind the attempt. It is also worth understanding a genuinely significant practical consideration that will likely shape how this entire competitive dynamic actually plays out over the coming years, related to the underlying technical foundation most of these newer AI native browsers are actually built on. Several of the newer entrants into this space, including some of the ones covered here, are themselves built on top of Chromium, the same open source browser engine that Chrome itself is built on, and that Google continues to develop and maintain as the underlying technical foundation. This creates a genuinely interesting dynamic worth appreciating fully, where even browsers explicitly positioning themselves as direct competitive threats to Chrome remain, at a fundamental technical level, built on infrastructure that Google itself continues to substantially shape and maintain, meaning the competition here is playing out considerably more at the level of the overlaid user experience and specific AI capabilities than at the level of truly independent, from-scratch underlying browser engine technology in most of these specific cases. Stepping back from the individual competitive players for a moment, there is a genuinely bigger, more consequential question worth considering here, one that extends well beyond simply which specific company's logo happens to appear in your taskbar. If AI native browsing genuinely does represent the kind of meaningful platform shift that its most genuine proponents argue it does, the actual stakes here extend considerably further than just which specific piece of software you personally happen to have installed. A browser increasingly capable of taking real actions on your behalf across the web, filling out forms, making purchases, comparing options, and synthesizing information from multiple sources without you needing to manually visit and read through each source individually. represents a genuinely significant new point of trust and control sitting directly between you and the entire rest of the internet. Whichever company or companies end up building the AI native browsing experience that genuinely achieves broad, mainstream adoption will hold a considerably more active, considerably more consequential role in shaping your actual daily internet experience than a traditional, purely passive browser ever meaningfully held before. Since an agent actively taking actions on your behalf carries genuinely different implications, both for convenience and for the trust and oversight that convenience necessarily requires, compared to a tool that simply displays whatever web page you specifically choose to manually navigate to yourself. This raises genuinely important, still largely unresolved questions worth thinking about carefully as this entire category continues to mature and evolve. Questions around exactly how much autonomous action any of us should be comfortable delegating to an AI browsing agent acting on our specific behalf, how transparently these AI native browsers actually disclose and explain the reasoning behind the specific actions they take when operating on your behalf, and how the underlying business models funding these newer AI native browsers, whether that ends up being subscription-based, advertising-based, following a broadly similar path to how Chrome itself has historically been monetized through its close integration with Google's advertising business, or something else entirely still being actively worked out, might ultimately shape the specific choices and recommendations these AI agents make on your behalf as this category continues maturing and scaling toward genuinely broad, mainstream adoption in the years ahead. So where does this actually leave things right now, honestly, as of where we currently stand in 2026? Chrome remains, by a considerable margin, the dominant browser across the world by nearly every currently measurable metric. And nothing covered in this video should be read as suggesting that dominance has already meaningfully eroded in any way you would currently notice reflected in actual global usage statistics. But the genuine, documented emergence of well-funded, seriously credible AI native alternatives, specifically built around a fundamentally different vision for what browsing itself can and should be, combined with the entirely separate, ongoing antitrust pressure. Google continues facing, specifically over Chrome's own market position, together represent the most serious, most multifaceted, competitive, and regulatory challenge Chrome has faced in the better part of a decade, arguably since Chrome itself first displaced Internet Explorer as the dominant browser all those years ago. Whether any of these specific new challengers ultimately succeed in meaningfully denting Chrome's dominant position over the coming years, or whether Google's own aggressive AI integration efforts alongside its continued massive existing user base advantage prove sufficient to successfully weather this particular wave of disruption, the same way it has successfully weathered every previous browser competition cycle over the past decade and a half, remains a genuinely open question actively being contested and tested in real time right now, rather than something already meaningfully resolved one way or the other. What is already clear, regardless of how that broader competitive question ultimately resolves itself, is that the assumption so many of us have quietly carried for years, that the specific question of which browser to use was already permanently settled and simply was not worth actively thinking about anymore, no longer holds up quite the same way it once did. For the first time in a genuinely long while, the browser sitting on your own computer right now is once again a genuinely live, actively contested question rather than a completely settled, unquestioned default. And that alone, regardless of which specific company or product ultimately comes out ahead in this particular round of competition, represents a meaningfully interesting, worthwhile moment for anyone who spends a significant portion of their daily life living inside a web browser to actually be paying close attention to. If you have already tried any of these newer AI native browsers yourself, drop a comment down below sharing your own honest experience with it, because hearing directly from people who have actually spent real time using these tools day to day genuinely helps everyone else watching get a clearer, more grounded sense of how this competition is actually playing out in practice, well beyond the more abstract feature list level comparisons alone. If you found this useful, make sure to hit that like button so more people get a clear, accurate, properly balanced picture of this genuinely significant shift currently unfolding, and subscribe with notifications turned on, because we will keep tracking exactly how this renewed browser competition continues to develop, honestly and without unnecessary hype, as this entire space continues evolving at a genuinely rapid pace.